Certain paintings in the history of art seem to make a very big impression on artists painting at the time and after. One of these paintings is called the Tribute Money, and it is a fresco actually in a chapel in Florence called the Brancacci Chapel. It was painted by a chap called Masaccio, who unfortunately died very young. I think he was about 27. And he was commissioned to paint it with an older artist called Masaccio, who was a much more conservative artist. The Tribute Money is taken from the New Testament, from the Gospel of Matthew, where Christ and the apostles have entered the town of Capernaum, and they're being asked to pay a tax. And Jesus suggests that he doesn't need to pay the tax, but in order to avoid problems, they will. But unfortunately, they don't have any money. And so Christ says to Peter to go to the Sea of Galilee and open the mouth of the first fish that he catches, and there he'll find a coin to pay the tax collector. And here we see in the centre the tax being demanded by the tax collector, who stands in front of the semicircle of the apostles surrounding Christ. But the tax collector is outside that circle. And the tax collector, to me, looks a little bit like one of the characters from Romeo and Juliet. He's young, totally different to the apostles. He looks like he could be pretty good with a sword. Notice, in a way, the arms of the tax collector and the arms of Christ and Peter. There is a sort of a mirror type image of that, and they point to the Sea of Galilee, and Peter is in the Sea of Galilee taking the coin out of the fish's mouth. And on the right side of this fresco, you see Peter calmly paying the tax collector, who actually does seem to have some form of sword. And so this painting is sometimes called a continuous narrative, because it actually has a story in three parts within a single painting. And that is an example of a style used in Roman antiquity in frescoes. But I want to look at the aspects of this fresco, this painting, which is so important and marks possibly the beginning of the modern form of painting in the Renaissance. So even though there's a lot going on in this painting, there are three sections to it, somehow our attention is drawn to the center of the painting of the figure of Christ and the apostles surrounding him in a semicircle. And there's a reason for this, because Masaccio is using linear perspective in the painting, and Christ is actually at the vanishing point, and the lines of the buildings, which are called orthogonals, those lines, if we extend them, go straight to Christ's face. But there's also another technique used to create space within this painting, because the painting has a background of mountains, and Masaccio is actually using something called atmospheric perspective. So the trees and the mountains closest to us are fairly distinct, and they're darker. But as we go further back, the mountains at the back and the sky, it becomes paler and less distinct, giving us again a feeling of three-dimensionality. By the way, the trees look a little bit bare. They apparently did have leaves, and they fell off during the last 500 years. But the figures themselves seem to have volume. They seem real. And there are a number of interesting techniques. So for instance, there's the use of light and dark called chiaroscuro, which basically is the fact that there's light coming from the right, and in the chapel itself there is a window and there is light coming from the window on the right, but in the fresco itself the light seems to create shadows, and those shadows can be seen in the robes that the apostles and Jesus are wearing. And also there are shadows, the legs and the feet are creating shadows on the floor. And another interesting aspect is the feet themselves are very accurately portrayed, and they seem to be planted. And if you look at some of the feet, for instance, of the tax collector and of one or two other apostles, the feet are foreshortened, so they actually give the impression again of three-dimensionality. And even the halos on Jesus and the apostles, if you look at them, they're elliptical, and again giving the impression of perspective, as though we're looking at them at an angle. Another aspect to give the figures a sense of reality is the way the tax collector is standing. Notice he's standing on one leg. His weight is on that leg, and he has his right leg with the ankle slightly above the floor. There's a sort of balance, a reality to this pose, and it's referred to as contrapposta, a counterpose. And again, if you look at many figures from Greek and Roman antiquity statues, you'll see that pose. So notice when the tax collector is being paid by Peter, he's again in contrapposta, but this time he's on the back foot, and maybe this is a sense of being more relaxed. Finally, look at the expressions on the characters in this fresco. So we have Christ looking calm, and then we have Peter in the centre looking distressed and worried. How are they going to pay this tax collector? And the other apostles have different expressions. And by the way, the apostle on the far right may be a self-portrait of Masaccio, but I'm not sure about that. So finally, we have many different techniques such as chiaroscuro, linear perspective, atmospheric perspective, foreshortening, expressions in the face, shadows, and this is possibly the first painting of its kind to bring in all these techniques. And we know that painters coming after Masaccio looked at this painting and possibly were influenced by it. We know for certain that Michelangelo sketched it at some point.